Yes, today is going to be interesting, it's going to be lively, and of course, you're going to learn something new. Yes, today we have an English language class, and our topic today is adverbial clauses. Adverbial clauses. In today's session, we're going to be starting with our introduction as usual. Then from there we talk about the performance objectives, we discuss the lesson content, we go for a short break, then we come back for the question and answer session. Please, as the lesson goes on, try to get your questions ready, post them on the chat in the chat room, and the questions will be attended to during the question and answer session. And after the question and answer session, we'll close for today. Yes, quickly let's look at the performance objectives. Today we're going to be learning 4 things. 1, the definition of adverbial clauses. 2, 5 types of adverbial clauses. 3, the grammatical function of adverbial clauses. And we as well answer questions on adverbial clauses. Now that means at the end of the lesson today, you're expected to be able to define adverbial clauses. You're also expected to be able to mention the 5 types of adverbial clauses and identify them. Also, you should be able to identify the grammatical function of adverbial clauses and as well answer questions on adverbial clauses. So we move on to the content of our lesson for today. We're starting with the definition of adverbial clause. What is an adverbial clause? Now, we cannot talk about an adverbial clause without understanding an adverb and a clause. Because adverbial clause is rooted in adverb and clause. And that is why it is essential for us to know what an adverb is and what a clause is. Now, what is an adverb? Please take note of some of the words that we'll be pointing at in the definition of an adverb. An adverb is a word that modifies. Please note that word modify. An adverb is a word that modifies. Now, what does an adverb modify? It modifies a verb, it modifies an adjective, and it also modifies another adverb. So simply put, an adverb is a word that modifies. Now, what do we mean by modifying? It tells us more, or it adds to the meaning of a verb, of an adjective, or an adverb. And what is a clause? A clause is a group of words with a finite verb. A clause is a group of words with a finite verb. Now, since we know the meaning of the definition of an adverb and the definition of a clause now, let's look at adverbial clause. What is an adverbial clause? Before we move on to that, let me clarify something here. A clause has 2 types. We have the main clause and we have the subordinate clause. Now, the subordinate clause is divided into 3. We have the noun clause, we have the adjectival clause, and then we have the adverbial clause. Now, what does that tell us? That means that an adverbial clause is a type of subordinate clause. So when we are talking about adverbial clauses, understand that adverbial clauses are usually subordinate clause. They are never main clauses. Main clauses do not have types, but subordinate clauses They are divided into three: the noun, the adjectival, and the adverbial clauses. So that brings us to the definition of an adverbial clause. Three things are important here. The word modifies, and also that it's a subordinate clause, and also what it modifies. Now, those three things are what we are putting together to define an adverbial clause. So simply put, an adverbial clause is a subordinate clause that functions as an adverb. An adverbial clause is a subordinate clause that functions as an adverb. And what does an adverb do? It modifies these things here: the verb, the adjective, and the adverb. Now, we know what an adverbial clause is. Let's move on to the types of adverbial clauses. Today, because of our time, we'll be looking at 5 types of adverbial clauses. We'll be looking at adverbial clause of time, adverbial clause of place, adverbial clause of manner, adverbial clause of reason, adverbial clause of condition. I go over them again. Adverbial clause of time, place, manner, reason, and condition. Now, those 5 adverbial clauses also have their types in adverb. We have adverb of place, adverb of time, adverb of manner, adverb of reason, adverb of condition. And so we have them in adverbial clauses also. And the way they function as adverbs is the same way they function as adverbial clauses. The only difference this time is that as an adverb, they are single words. But as an adverbial clause, they occur as a clause, that is, a group of words with a finite verb. But they still perform the same function as an adverb. Now let's look at them one after the other. We'll start with adverbial clause of time. Adverbial clause of time. Now, adverbial clause of time gives information about the time in which an action is being performed. It gives information about the time in which an action is being performed. Now, it answers the question when. That means an adverbial clause tells us when an action occurred, when something happened. And there are some markers of adverbial clauses of time. That is, some words that are used to introduce adverbial clauses of time. Now, some of those words are when, whenever, before, after, as soon as, while, and so on. Now let's look at some examples in order to explain that. It came when I was about to leave. It came when I was about to leave. I just told you that adverbials of time are introduced by when. That means that they begin sometimes with when. So that brings us to the adverbial clause in this expression. When I was about to leave. That's the adverbial clause. When I was about to leave. Now, I told you that it answers the question when. If I ask you, when did he come? The answer will be, he came when I was about to leave. So the time he came was the time when I was about to leave. So that's an adverbial clause of time. Now, what makes this a clause? It is a clause because it has a finite verb. And this here is the finite verb. Was. Now, we identify it as a clause, and we also can identify it as an adverbial clause because it is telling us the time that an action occurred. So what is the name? Two questions come up in this place in external examination, particularly WAEC and NECO examination. Now, the first question that we ask you is, what is the grammatical name? And the second question is, what is the grammatical function? We have identified the grammatical name as adverbial clause of time. What is the grammatical function? This adverbial clause of time is telling us about something. It is modifying something. It is corroborating this verb came. It is telling us the time that he came. So we say it modifies. This word modifies is very important. Don't forget that when we define an adverb, we said an adverb modifies. So that is the same thing we use in adverbial clauses. So this expression, when I was about to leave, modifies the verb came. So this is the grammatical name, and this is the grammatical function. Adverbial clause of time modifying the verb came. Now let's look at another example there. Let's look at another example. Before we responded, they had run away. Before we responded, they had run away. Now that's the expression. Before we responded, here is telling us the time that they ran away. That is, they had run away before we responded. How do we identify that this is a clause? Because it has a finite verb, responded. And now we know that it is an adverbial clause because it is telling us the time that something happened. So what is the grammatical name of this expression? Adverbial clause of time. And what is the grammatical function? It is modifying a verb. Just like in the first example, this expression will not modify a verb that is still in the subordinate clause. It will modify a verb that is outside the subordinate clause. And that means it will modify the verb that is in the main clause. So this is the main clause. They had run away. So this expression before we responded is modifying, in this case now, not a verb, but a verb phrase. Why is it a verb phrase? Because we now have more than one word. So it is functioning as, it modifies the verb phrase had run away. It modifies the verb phrase had run away. Now let's look at one more example here. As soon as the rain subsided, the show began. As soon as the rain subsided, the show began. When did the rain begin? As soon as, sorry, when did the show begin? When did the show begin? As soon as the rain subsided. The show began as soon as, so the time the show began was when the rain subsided. And that tells us that the grammatical name of this is adverbial clause of time. And what's the grammatical function? It modifies the verb show. Now let's move on to the next type of adverbial clause, and that is adverbial clause of place. Adverbial clause of place. Now this clause shows the place where an action took place. Adverbial clause of time shows the time. It tells us when. Adverbial clause of place, on the other hand, shows the place where an action took place. So in this case, it answers the question where. Where did it happen? And usually it is introduced by the words where, wherever, in most cases where and wherever, and some other ones. Now we're going to look at some examples here. Wherever he goes, he finds help easily. Now the adverbial clause here is wherever he goes. So the grammatical name here is adverbial clause of place. And the grammatical function modifies the verb, phrase. Finds help. Don't forget that when you have more than one verb, it becomes a verb phrase there. Okay. So it modifies the verb phrase, finds help. The second example here, I saw Felix where he was fighting. I saw Felix where he was fighting. Yes, where did I see Felix? I saw him where he was fighting. The place where he was fighting. So the grammatical name here, adverbial clause of place. And the grammatical function, as usual, is to modify the verb in the main clause. And the verb in the main clause here is saw. So the grammatical function modifies the verb saw. So that's adverbial clause of place. Let's move on to number 3. That's adverbial clause of manner. Adverbial clause of manner. Now what is manner? Manner is the way something is done. So adverbial clause of manner tells us about the way an action is being performed. And it answers the question how. How did you do it? How did it go? So it tells us about the way an action is being performed and answers the question how. It is usually introduced by words such as if, as though, and the likes. Now let me give us an example. She spoke to me as if she was my mother. Now I can ask, how did she speak to me? She spoke to me as if she was my mother. Now we know this is a clause because it has a finite verb, was. And we know it is an adverbial clause of manner because it is introduced by this, as if, telling us how she spoke to me. Now, what is the grammatical name? Adverbial clause of manner. And what is the grammatical function? Don't forget that it will modify a verb in the main clause. The verb in the main clause, spoke. So the grammatical function, it modifies the verb spoke. Now let's look at another example there. The whole event happened as we expected. The whole event happened as we expected. Yeah, the whole event happened as we expected. How did the whole event happen? As we expected. It happened. How? As we expected. So this is a clause because it has a finite verb. And we know it's an adverbial clause because it is introduced by as, telling us the manner in which something happened. So the grammatical name adverbial clause of manner. And the grammatical function. Now don't forget that it's going to modify a verb in the main clause. And in this case, happened. Modifies the verb happened. Now let's look at one more example here. The old man looked as though he was in pain. The old man looked as though he was in pain. How did the old man look? He looked as though he was in pain. That's the manner in which he looked. Now, we know that this is a clause because it has a finite verb, was. And it's an adverbial clause of manner because it is introduced by as, telling us the manner in which something happened. So the grammatical name adverbial clause of manner. And the grammatical function, modifying a verb in the main clause now. And in this case, looked. Modifies the verb looked. Now we move on to the next one, and which is adverbial clause of reason. Adverbial clause of reason. Now, adverbial clause of reason tells us why an action is performed. We all know reason is why. So adverbial clause of reason tells us why an action is performed. So it answers the question why. And usually it is introduced by words like because, that, since, and so on. Now let's look at these examples. He felt bad because he was badly insulted. He felt bad because he was bad. Why did he feel bad? Because he was badly insulted. That was why he felt bad. Now, this has a finite verb, was. And so it is a clause. And it is introduced by because, telling us the reason for something. And so the grammatical name for this, adverbial clause of reason. And the function, don't forget, it is going to modify a verb in the main clause. And in this case, felt. So the grammatical function modifies the verb felt. Now let's look at another example. I am glad that you know the truth. I am glad that you know the truth. Why am I glad? What is the reason? Because I know that you know the truth. So what is the grammatical name? Adverbial clause of reason. Introduced by that. And then what is the function? It modifies the verb am. And finally, let's look at one more example. Since I will be leaving early, I will eat in the office. So in this case, since I will be leaving early is the adverbial clause of reason, and it is modifying the verb phrase will eat. So quickly, because of our time, let's move to the next one and the last one, and that's adverbial clause of condition. Adverbial clause of condition. Now, adverbial clause of condition indicates the prerequisite for an action. That is what is required for something to happen. It usually answers the question, upon what condition? That is, upon what condition should this be? And they are usually introduced by words such as unless, provided that, if, except, until, and so on. Now let's look at some examples. Provided you know him, you can consult him. Provided you know him, you can consult him. Now, this means that the condition upon which you should consult him is that you know him. So that means if you don't know him, don't consult him. But provided you know him, consult him. So that is the condition. So that is adverbial clause of condition. And it is modifying the verb phrase can consult. Modifies the verb phrase can consult. And let's look at another example there. Unless you pay the sacrifice, it will not happen by chance. Unless you pay the sacrifice, it will not happen by chance. Now, unless you pay the sacrifice is the adverbial clause of condition there. So unless you pay the sacrifice. So the condition for it to happen is that you pay the sacrifice. Without paying the sacrifice, it is not going to happen. And here, it is modifying the verb phrase will not happen. It modifies the verb phrase will not happen. So those are the 5 types of adverbial clauses that we'll be looking at today. Quickly, let's go over all that we have said in the course of this lesson. Yes, we started with the definition of adverbial clause, and we deduced our definition by looking at the meaning of adverb and also the meaning of a clause. We defined an adverb as a word that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb, and a clause as a group of words with a finite verb. And so we also said that a clause has the main clause and the subordinate clause. Now, the subordinate clause is the one that has different types: the noun clause, the adjectival clause, and the adverbial clause. So the adverbial clause is a type of subordinate clause that functions as an adverb. The adverbial clause is a type of subordinate clause that functions as an adverb. That is, it modifies verb, adjective, and another adverb. And so we looked at 5 types of adverbial clauses: the adverbial clause of time, of place, manner, reason, and condition. And we also made it clear that these adverbial clauses, they also occur as adverbs. So we can also have adverbs of time, place, manner, reason, and so on. Yes, I also mentioned that those are not the only 5 types, but because of our time, we restrict ourselves to those 5. And we discussed adverbial clause of time as those adverbs that gives us information about the time in which an action is being performed. And we said it answers the question when. And usually they are introduced by words such as when, whenever, before, after, as soon as, while, and so on. Then we talked about adverbial clause of place as those adverbs that shows the place where an action took place. And they answer the question where, and usually introduced by where and wherever. Then we talked about adverbial clause of manner as the type of adverb that shows us the way in which an action is being performed, that is, the how. And so they are introduced by words such as if, as though, and so on. Then adverbial clause of reason, it is that type of adverb that tells us the why, gives us the reason why something happened. And so they are introduced by words such as because, that, and so on. And finally, we talked about adverbial clause of condition as indicators of prerequisites of an action. That is, they tell us upon what condition something happens. and they are usually introduced by words such as if, unless, provided that, except, until, and so on. So those are the 5 types of adverbial clauses that we discussed this morning. We saw some of your questions, and quickly I will answer those questions. Now, the first question by Julie: kindly explain main clause. Now, main clause are simply the clauses that can stand on their own and they make meaning. Now, if you look at some of those examples that we gave while explaining the different types of adverbial clauses. For instance, look at this. She spoke to me as if she was my mother. She spoke to me as if she was my mother. Okay, let me use this one on the board first before that. Unless you pay the sacrifice, it will not happen. Now, if you look at this first statement, unless you pay the sacrifice, yes, it is a clause, but does that really make sense on its own? Of course, you will ask, unless you pay the sacrifice. In what context? What do you mean? But if I tell you, it will not happen by chance, that makes sense. You can make sense out of that. It simply means that it will not just happen. So that means this clause that can stand on its own is the main clause. This one that cannot stand on its own is a subordinate clause. I want to use another one. She spoke to me as if she was my mother. We underline this as our adverbial, and of course it is also a subordinate clause. As if she was my mother. Yes, it has a verb, but it doesn't make sense. But if I tell you, she spoke to me, does that make sense to you? Yes, it does. She spoke to me. So this subordinate clause is just more like an addendum, additional information. But a main clause can stand on its own without the help of a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause, on the other hand, we need a main clause to make absolute sense. Now, the second thing you have to understand about main clauses, subordinate clauses and main clauses is that subordinate clauses are most times introduced by what we call subordinating conjunctions. So you can read up on subordinating conjunctions. So subordinate clauses are mostly introduced by subordinating conjunctions, and that is why we call them subordinate clauses. But main clauses are not introduced by subordinating conjunctions. So with those two things, you can differentiate a main clause from a subordinate clause. Julie, I hope I answered your question. Anthony said, I most times find it difficult to tell the type of clause and its function in a long paragraph. Yes, I understand that very well. But let me tell you the logic. The logic is you have to know all those types of clauses. I don't know if you were part of the class when we did noun clauses. We have discussed noun clauses. If you were not in the class, you can go to the Learn at Home site. You will see that video there. Watch the video again on noun clauses. Now, if you understand noun clauses, you understand adverbial clauses, you understand adjectival clauses very well. We discuss adjectival clauses very soon too, if you vote for it. Now, if you understand those 3 different types of clauses very well, it will be easier for you to differentiate them in a paragraph. But if you know only one and you don't know the 2 other ones, or you know 2, you don't know the last one, it may be hard. So please, just know that you have to understand those 3 types of clauses very well for you to be able to differentiate them in a long paragraph. I hope that answers your question, Anthony. Faith Onyidamola, please explain adverbial clause of reason. Okay, let me quickly go over adverbial clause of reason again. Now, I told you that adverbial clause of reason, they answer the question why. You know, when you say reason, reason is why. Why did it happen? So adverbial clause of reason, they tell us why something happened, why an action is performed. And most times they are introduced by the words because, that, and the likes. So like the example there says, he felt bad because he was badly insulted. Now, why did he feel bad? Because he was bad. So the reason he felt bad was because he was badly insulted. So I hope that answers your question. Onyidamola Faith. Now, those are the 3 questions, and I hope I've been able to answer them. Let's look at our questions for discussion today. I have about 5 questions here. I would have loved to just throw it to you. My mom bought me a PS5 because I passed my examination. We want to identify the grammatical name and also state their grammatical function. If you can see those 3 questions on your screen and you know the answer to any, just simply type it in. Unless you do the assignment, we cannot be friends. Mr. Benson has always addressed his students as if they were mates. So look at those 3 questions. I'm giving you just 1 minute to do that. Look at them very well. If you know their answer, the grammatical name and the function, that is, you tell me what type of adverbial they are, and you also tell me the function. Which verb are they modifying? So if you know that, 1 minute to do that. 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute. My mom bought me a PS5 because I passed my examination. Any one of the 3, you can just answer. Just write the number 2. Do we have any answer there? Okay, my mom bought me a PS5 because I passed my examination. Don't forget that because is used to introduce reason. So that is an adverbial clause of reason. So it is modifying the verb but. Modifying the verb but. Then number 2, unless you do the assignment, we cannot be friends. Unless you do it, that's the condition for us to be friends. So that's an adverbial clause of condition. Modifying the verb cannot. Mr. Benson has always addressed his students as if they were mates. Excuse me. How does he address them? As if they were mates. That's manner. Excuse me. We have 2 more. Don't talk while I am teaching. When are you not supposed to talk? The time that I am teaching. So that's what? That's time. So wherever we went, we were celebrated. We were celebrated wherever, that's place. So, and don't talk while I'm teaching. While I'm teaching, adverbial clause of time, and it modifies don't. Wherever we went, adverbial clause of place modifies where. Modifies the verb phrase were celebrated. So we come to the end of our class for today. Thank you for attending to this session. Invite your friends for the next class. It's going to be interesting again. For further reading and reference on this particular topic, adverbial clauses, please select adverbial clauses lesson content on learnathome.ng. Do join us next week, same time, for another wonderful session. I remain your English language instructor, Esther Alade. Thank you for joining.